Hey guys, tonight we slip back in time, into a young United States still wet with ink from its declaration, its constitution barely tested, its streets filled with muddy boots and whispered arguments about what money even means. You can almost smell the raw wood of unfinished buildings, hear the clink of coins from different lands still rattling in the pockets of merchants, and feel the uneasy hum of a nation unsure whether its paper promises are worth more than the paper they're printed on. If you ever tried to survive in this economy, with merchants refusing your notes and demanding Spanish silver instead, you'd probably last about a week before bartering your shoes for bread. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? And what time is it right now? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You march through the uneven cobblestone of Philadelphia in the 1790s, when the word dollar is more a hope than a habit. The Coinage Act of 1792 has just defined it, borrowing inspiration from the Spanish dollar, the famous pieces of 8 that circulated across continents. Yet, despite Congress's grand words, the new mint struggles to stamp coins fast enough. And in practice, foreign silver coins still dominate everyday trade. You reach into your pocket and find that your neighbor might trust a Spanish real more than a shiny new American cent. That's the quirk of the early dollar. It exists by law, but not fully in daily life. You step into a tavern, dimly lit, where farmers grumble about debts and merchants argue about credit. Paper money issued during the Revolutionary War, the infamous Continental, lingers like a bad memory. Not worth a Continental, people mutter, recalling how hyperinflation made those notes as useless as tinder. Historians still argue whether that collapse was inevitable or whether stronger taxation could have saved it. Either way, the distrust lingers, a ghost haunting every attempt at new currency. As you sip a mug of weak ale, you hear talk of Alexander Hamilton. The man, sharp-eyed and tireless, has been pushing for a strong national bank to stabilize the economy. His vision is bold: a federal system to issue notes backed by the government's credibility. Yet, across the room, a farmer slams his fist on the table, muttering Jefferson's warnings about tyranny, debt, and the dangers of money being controlled by a powerful few. That's the tension you feel. A nation pulled between dreams of strong financial order and fears of centralized control. Out on the dusty streets, the first Bank of the United States opens its doors in 1791, issuing notes intended to circulate widely. You watch clerks carefully counting stacks of paper marked with official seals, promising value in silver and gold. And yet, far from the cities, many still mistrust these slips, preferring hard coin that clinks in their palms. Quirky details emerge. Some shopkeepers bite coins to test their authenticity, leaving faint tooth marks in the silver. Others weigh them, fearing shaved edges from those who snip precious metal for profit. The dollar is officially defined, 24.1 grams of silver. But in practice, you notice that no one has a single, shared sense of stability. State banks issue their own notes, merchants hoard Spanish silver, and farmers still barter when trust runs thin. This is not yet the mighty greenback world. It's a patchwork quilt of money, stitched together with equal parts ambition and uncertainty. In a crowded marketplace, a woman selling cloth refuses your new US cent and instead points to the Mexican peso dangling from your belt. Real money, she says firmly, handing you a bolt of homespun linen. Scholars debate how much this reliance on foreign silver slowed the rise of the dollar. But what's certain is that America's own currency, in its infancy, leaned heavily on older empires' coins. You can almost hear the irony in the clatter of those pesos on American counters. As you stroll further, you pass notices nailed to wooden posts about counterfeiters, rogue printers churning out fake notes in dimly lit basements. Some forgeries are laughably crude, with mismatched fonts and blurred seals, but others are so convincing that even trained clerks are fooled. The fragility of paper, the temptation of quick wealth, and the uneven flow of coins make the dollar's early life more fragile than its framers intended. At night, you lie in a small inn, the sound of wagons creaking outside, and you wonder, can a nation truly become great if its money isn't trusted? Hamilton thinks yes. Jefferson thinks no, and the average farmer just wants to be paid in something that doesn't vanish in value overnight. This uncertainty hums beneath every exchange, like a faint background note that refuses to resolve. By the end of the century, you find the dollar slowly gaining traction, its definition in silver giving it legitimacy, even as foreign coins continue to jingle alongside. A quirky footnote lingers in your mind. The first official U.S. silver dollar, the flowing hair coin of 1794. So rare today that collectors whisper about it like a holy relic. Was it a true beginning of the dollar's global journey, or just another experiment in a world still clinging to trusted Spanish silver? Historians still debate. But for you, standing in the candlelit glow of a new nation, the dollar feels less like a king and more like a child, learning to walk, stumbling often, but refusing to fall. You walk into the 19th century with the smell of ink and heated debate lingering in the air. For the young American dollar is no longer just a curiosity. It's a battlefield. Gold, silver, and paper compete for legitimacy. And the ordinary people in taverns, farms, and courtrooms argue as fiercely as senators in Washington. You hear the word bimetallism whispered like a charm spell, a promise that both gold and silver could anchor money's value. Yet you also sense the tension. For every coin struck at the mint reflects not only metal, but trust. And that trust is fragile. As you ride a horse-drawn carriage down muddy country roads, you carry a purse heavy with silver dollars. They gleam with Lady Liberty's face, but their value shifts with every fluctuation in world markets. One day, your silver buys a sack of flour. Another day, the same silver feels less welcome in shops that favor gold coins. The Coinage Act of 1834 tilts the balance by revaluing gold, making it cheaper relative to silver. Historians still argue whether Congress acted out of economic foresight or political convenience. But you see the results firsthand. Gold suddenly flows more freely. Silver quietly slips from circulation, and merchants begin to prefer gold coins that feel more modern and internationally respected. Inside a crowded general store, you overhear farmers muttering about soft money versus hard money. Paper bills, issued by local banks, flutter through their hands, promises scrawled in ink that might or might not be honored. Some banks fold within months, leaving worthless scraps. Others thrive, their notes trusted within entire regions. You can't help but smile at a quirky detail. Some notes are decorated with elaborate engravings of trains, ships, and even farm animals, meant to deter counterfeiters, but also serving as miniature art pieces that townsfolk admire. The Civil War explodes across the landscape, and suddenly money becomes as much a weapon as muskets. You wander through Union camps, where soldiers receive greenbacks, paper notes backed not by gold or silver, but by the government's determination to survive. They smell of fresh ink and desperation. Some merchants reject them, demanding coin instead, while others accept them at a discount. By night, soldiers gamble with greenbacks under lantern light, their laughter masking the gnawing uncertainty of what those notes will be worth when the fighting ends. Meanwhile, across Confederate lines, Gray-clad soldiers carry their own paper currency, festooned with images of southern plantations and noble leaders. Yet, inflation devours it quickly, leaving soldiers and civilians clutching bills that lose value faster than they can be spent. Quirky anecdotes abound. Confederate women fashion dresses from worthless bills, stitching them into fabric as a silent protest against money that betrayed them. After the war, you step into Reconstruction-era banks, where debates rage over returning to the gold standard. Bankers in stiff collars insist that gold alone ensures stability, while farmers in worn boots plead for more flexible silver and greenbacks to ease their debts. The crime of 1873, as critics call it, demonetizes silver, sparking fury across rural America. You feel the anger in their words, a belief that elites in eastern cities have conspired to choke farmers with tight money. Historians still debate whether this was truly a crime or simply an adaptation to global markets. But the perception lingers, fueling populist movements. On a dusty frontier town street, you witness silver miners cheering the bland Allison Act of 1878, which restores limited silver coinage. They raise glasses in saloons, celebrating as if money itself has been resurrected. Yet in practice, the compromise satisfies few. Silver enthusiasts demand more, gold advocates roll their eyes, and the public remains caught between shifting standards. As the century wanes, you find yourself at a political rally where a young William Jennings Bryan thunders about crucifixion on a cross of gold. The crowd erupts, farmers waving hats, miners cheering, bankers scowling. His words echo across the prairie, a battle cry for silver and inflationary relief. And yet, his cause falters as the gold standard tightens its grip. The United States, seeking credibility with European markets, clings to gold as its anchor. The dollar's path toward global power requires stability. But stability feels cold comfort to indebted farmers staring at withering crops. You pause in a small-town parlor where families gather around oil lamps, passing around both paper notes and coins. They juggle them, comparing weight and texture, debating which feels real. Children bite coins for fun, leaving tiny impressions of their teeth, while adults shake their heads at the fragile balance of trust. This domestic ritual, ordinary yet intimate, reminds you that the dollar's story isn't only written in treaties and laws, but in daily gestures of belief. Scholarly uncertainty lingers over whether the United States could have charted a different course. Perhaps embracing bimetallism fully, perhaps leaning into silver instead of gold. Would that have altered the dollar's global fate? Historians disagree. But standing in the twilight of the 19th century, you sense that the die is cast. Gold glimmers as the chosen foundation, and the greenback begins to shed its stigma, inching toward legitimacy. The dollar's future, though still uncertain, feels less like a child stumbling, and more like a youth learning to run, awkward but determined, chasing horizons beyond America's shores. You enter the roaring hum of the late 19th century, when the United States grows restless with its own financial heartbeats. The sound is uneven, a sudden boom of prosperity, then a deafening crash, followed by whispers of recovery. You find yourself inside a crowded New York bank in 1873. The year the first of many financial panics sweeps through. Clerks scramble behind polished counters, their quills scratching across ledgers as anxious depositors line the halls, fists clenched around paper notes they're desperate to exchange for gold or silver. Outside, the air is thick with the murmur of ruined fortunes. A railroad speculation bubble bursts, sending shockwaves across the country. You watch as farmers lose access to credit, shopkeepers shutter their doors, and railroads themselves, symbols of progress, rust quietly in fields. This isn't just economics, it's lived experience. The the way trust in money can evaporate faster than the ink that prints it. A quirky detail floats to your attention. In some towns, desperate workers create scrip, homemade paper tokens issued by local companies, redeemable only in their own stores. They smell faintly of sawdust and sweat, a fragile promise in place of real wages. You wander forward in time to 1893, another panic. This one unfolds with eerie similarity. Banks failing, unemployment soaring, soup kitchens multiplying. Men stand on street corners offering to sell apples for pennies, their hats pulled low to avoid shameful recognition. The dollar, once debated between silver and gold, now feels like a brittle bone, easily cracked by overreach and speculation. Historians still argue whether these panics were inevitable growing pains of a rising industrial giant or the result of flawed policies and unchecked greed. Either way, for you walking these streets, the dollar seems less like a symbol of power and more like a mirror of fragility. By 1907, the whispers of reform grow louder. You step into the House of Morgan, J.P. Morgan himself looming like a stern patriarch, cigar smoke curling above his desk. Banks collapse across the nation, and crowds gather outside his home, pleading for salvation. Morgan, with all the confidence of one man who believes he can control a storm, orchestrates a private rescue, pulling together financiers to stabilize the system. You hear the irony. A single individual, not the government, becomes the last defense against financial collapse. Newspapers hail him as a savior, though critics mutter that one man wielding such influence is dangerous. Scholars still debate whether Morgan truly prevented a deeper collapse or simply protected his own empire. But for you, standing in the marble hall of his library, as agreements are signed under dim chandeliers, the lesson is clear. America cannot rely forever on private tycoons to save its currency. The calls for reform grow insistent, carried on the wind of small towns and great cities alike. Bankers demand stability, farmers demand fair credit, and politicians argue over who should hold the reins. The debate circles back to the age-old tension. Should money be tightly controlled, like a disciplined soldier, or loosely expanded, like a river nourishing all who drink from it? In 1910, you board a quiet train bound for Jekyll Island, off the coast of Georgia. The car rattles softly as a group of men, disguised with code names, carry suitcases heavy with papers. They whisper of reserves, centralization, and a plan to anchor the dollar firmly to a system that could prevent panics. You arrive at a secluded club, its oak doors closed to the outside world. Inside, senators and bankers lean close over polished tables, drafting the bones of what would become the Federal Reserve. It feels conspiratorial, a secret birth of a new guardian for money. Historians argue whether this secrecy was necessary prudence or a troubling sign of elite control. A quirky moment arises. One attendee recalls later that they pretended to be duck hunters, lest curious locals ask questions. You picture them, these architects of finance, tramping through marshes with borrowed shotguns, all while sketching plans that would reshape the global economy. When the Federal Reserve is finally created in 1913, you walk through its halls in Washington, freshly painted, smelling of varnish and ambition. Clerks shuffle papers that outline its mission: to steady the currency, regulate banks, and serve as lender of last resort. You hear the buzz of hope in their voices, yet also the lingering skepticism outside these walls. Farmers still recall worthless Continentals, merchants still prefer hard coin, and skeptics mutter that this new Fed is just another elite tool. As night falls, you pause at a lamplit desk, running your fingers across the first Federal Reserve notes, crisp and promising. They carry the weight of government authority and the sheen of new beginnings. Will they succeed in taming the dollar's wild swings? Or will they too stumble into the long shadow of distrust? Historians still wrestle with the answer. But for you, drifting through the early 20th century, the stage feels set. The dollar has grown from fragile child to ambitious youth. And now it seeks its own guardian, a system that might one day make it strong enough to leave its borders and claim the world's attention. You stand at the dawn of 1913, the air still sharp with winter, when a new institution rises like a nervous heartbeat beneath the marble halls of Washington, the Federal Reserve. The name itself feels like a promise, though to ordinary people it is mostly a mystery. You wander through the corridors of the Capitol as legislators quietly debate, their words heavy with compromise. Some speak of the need to tame wild panics. Others warn of handing too much power to unseen bankers. Yet the vote passes, and the Federal Reserve Act is signed in December, a law meant to give the American dollar something it has always lacked: a steady anchor. You push open the grand wooden doors of the brand new Federal Reserve Board, where clerks scurry with papers, drafting rules for banks and sketching maps of 12 regional districts. Each district will hold its own reserve bank, a strange federal yet local structure meant to balance power. You hear the scratching of quills, the rattle of typewriters, and the nervous coughs of men trying to sound confident while stepping into unknown territory. Historians still argue whether this structure was brilliant compromise or confused half-measure. But in these early days, it feels like the birth of something both fragile and immense. In a vault, freshly polished steel doors gleam in the gaslight. New currency notes, stamped with Federal Reserve across their face, rest in tidy stacks. They smell of ink and promise. A quirky detail catches your eye. The first series of Federal Reserve notes in 1914 depict not presidents, but allegorical figures, images of labor, industry, and agriculture, as if the nation wants to remind itself that money is tied to work, not just politics. You wander into a small-town bank in Ohio a few years later, where a teller carefully explains to a farmer that these new notes can be trusted, that they are backed by reserves and by the government itself. The farmer squints, skeptical, running the bill between calloused fingers. Trust is slow to build. Coins still jingle in his pockets, and memories of worthless paper from earlier decades haunt him. Yet the notes spread, carried in wallets and wages, stitched quietly into daily life. The Federal Reserve flexes its power for the first time during World War I. You walk through the streets of New York in 1917, when Liberty Loan posters plaster every wall. Buy bonds, they urge, promising both patriotism and profit. Banks, supported by the Fed, channel money into the war effort, and for the first time, the dollar begins to travel far beyond America's borders. Soldiers march through muddy fields in Europe with pay carried in greenbacks. And across the Atlantic, European governments borrow heavily in dollars to fund their own survival. You realize the irony. A nation once unsure of its own paper now lends it to the world. Still, the system creaks under strain. Inflation rises as the war consumes resources, and ordinary citizens grumble at rising prices. You sit in a crowded kitchen where a mother stirs thin soup, muttering that her wages don't stretch as far as they did last year. Historians debate whether the Fed managed this inflation well or whether it was learning on the job, clumsy and inexperienced. What is clear is that the dollar, for better or worse, is no longer confined to America's borders. It has become part of the global bloodstream. The 1920s bring a different rhythm. Jazz spills from speakeasies, skyscrapers pierce the skyline, and the dollar seems untouchable. You wander through Wall Street, where ticker machines clatter endlessly, spitting out prices as traders cheer and groan. The Federal Reserve, still young, experiments with interest rates, trying to cool speculation without quenching growth. Some scholars later wonder if the Fed's choices fed the very bubble that burst in 1929. The debate continues, unresolved, like a discordant note beneath the music of the Roaring Twenties. A quirky image stays with you. Investors lining up outside brokerage houses to watch prices projected on chalkboards, their breath fogging in the winter air as they cheer tiny upticks or groan at plunges. Money has become spectacle. The dollar a star in a drama whose ending no one yet imagines. As you drift toward the decade's close, the cracks widen. In small towns, farmers already feel the strain, their debts mounting. In big cities, fortunes vanish overnight as the market trembles. You sense it. That fragile heartbeat the Federal Reserve was meant to steady, now quickening dangerously. The dollar has traveled far since its hesitant beginnings, but as the 1930s approach, you can already hear the low rumble of collapse on the horizon. You feel the floorboards of the 20th century tremble as you step into the maelstrom of World War I, the first great test of both the Federal Reserve and the dollar itself. The year is 1917, and posters on every lamppost shout their messages in bold letters. Buy Liberty bonds. The colors are bright, the fonts dramatic, and the images often stirring. Lady Liberty holding a torch, soldiers marching shoulder to shoulder, families staring hopefully into a future promised by paper bonds. You join a crowd at a street corner where a brass band plays, whipping up excitement as townsfolk step forward to subscribe to war debt. The Federal Reserve, barely 4 years old, becomes the silent machinery behind these campaigns. You walk into one of its district banks where clerks, their sleeves rolled up, tally the inflow of dollars that will be turned into loans for the government. The clatter of typewriters fills the air, blending with the metallic snap of ledgers closing. For the first time, the dollar is mobilized not just to oil the gears of domestic trade, but to fuel global conflict. You drift across the Atlantic to war-torn France. American soldiers, their uniforms stiff with mud, carry pay envelopes lined with greenbacks. In dim cafes in Paris, French waiters accept dollars with an almost reverent smile, exchanging them for coffee, bread, or cigarettes. The franc feels unstable, but the dollar, strange and new to many Europeans, begins to signal reliability. Historians argue about whether this moment marks the true beginning of the dollar's international role, or merely a wartime convenience. Still, you can hear the distinct sound of trust forming with each transaction, the green ink of America's paper weaving itself into Europe's everyday life. Meanwhile, back in New York, Wall Street pulses with transatlantic energy. Ships depart the harbor heavy with food, weapons, and supplies, and behind them flow streams of credit, dollar-denominated loans that European governments beg for. Britain, long the world's financial hub, finds itself borrowing from America, a subtle but monumental shift. You pause at a banker's desk and watch him sign a loan agreement worth millions in dollars, his pen scratching over parchment as though etching a new chapter of history. Quirky details surface in the chaos. In some European towns, children collect dollar notes as souvenirs, pressing them into scrapbooks alongside candy wrappers and stamps. In London, American doughboys swagger into pubs, their dollars exchanged for pounds at favorable rates, prompting locals to joke that America's green paper seems to stretch farther than their own sterling coins. But even as the dollar stretches across oceans, tensions simmer. Inflation rises at home, gnawing at the purchasing power of ordinary citizens. You sit in a kitchen in Ohio, where a family of 5 shares stew thinned with water, the mother sighing as she counts her grocery bill. The price of flour, butter, and sugar creeps higher, eroding wages. Scholars still debate whether the Federal Reserve could have curbed this inflation more skillfully, or whether it was doomed to stumble in its infancy. The war ends in 1918, but the dollar's foreign adventure does not. Reparations, loans, and reconstruction tether Europe to American credit. You walk through the streets of Berlin in the early 1920s, where inflation rages, and yet shopkeepers whisper that if only they could hold their savings in dollars instead of marks, they might escape ruin. The German mark collapses so violently that people cart wheelbarrows of notes to buy bread. While across the Atlantic, the dollar's relative stability gleams like a beacon. In Paris, at the post-war negotiations, you hear diplomats muttering about debts denominated in dollars. The greenback becomes not just America's money, but a new measuring stick of value. Yet even here, uncertainty remains. Britain clings to its pound sterling, insisting that London remains the world's financial capital. Historians argue whether the dollar has already surpassed the pound, or whether it will take another global cataclysm to cement its supremacy. You return to New York in the 1920s, just in time to watch skyscrapers climb into the sky. The dollar, strengthened by wartime lending, now circulates freely in markets that once only dealt in pounds or francs. On a warm evening, you stand at the base of the brand-new Chrysler Building, marveling at its gleaming Art Deco spire. A monument not only to steel and ambition, but also to the wealth denominated in dollars that fuels such projects. The atmosphere feels heady, confident, unstoppable. Dollar bills pass from hand to hand in speakeasies where jazz musicians play until dawn, in department stores where women in flapper dresses finger pearls and perfume, and in brokerage houses where ticker machines rattle endlessly. And yet, beneath the exuberance, a whisper of unease lingers. Scholarly uncertainty clouds the air. Did the Federal Reserve's policies in the 1920s, tinkering with interest rates to restrain speculation, accidentally create the very bubble that burst in 1929? Some argue the Fed should have tightened sooner. Others insist it should have stayed hands-off. You, watching from the balcony of a busy stock exchange, see only the frenzy of buying, the rising tide of optimism that blinds so many. By the decade's end, the dollar has traveled far. Once a fragile child mistrusted in taverns and farms, it now stands tall in global transactions, loaning its strength across oceans. Yet, as you step into the 1930s, you can already feel the chill of collapse in the air, a cold wind that rustles even the crispest green bills, reminding you that trust, once gained, can vanish overnight. You step softly into the 1930s, and the streets are quiet in a way that feels unnatural, as if commerce itself has forgotten how to breathe. Storefronts are shuttered, their windows coated with dust. Banks, once brimming with confident clerks, now stand empty. Doors chained, the words "closed by order of the government" tacked onto wooden frames. You smell the acrid scent of burnt paper from fires where families toss in worthless stock certificates to keep warm. The dollar, which once strutted proudly through the roaring 20s, now limps, fragile and distrusted. You drift toward a bank run in 1933, the air thick with anxiety. Hundreds crowd outside a heavy door, clutching small leather purses, tin boxes, and envelopes. They plead for their deposits, desperate to swap paper for gold before it is too late. Inside, a teller whispers to his colleague that the vault is nearly empty. Each coin handed over feels like water draining from a cracked barrel. Quirky details surface. Some depositors bring actual scales, weighing gold coins on the steps, suspicious of being shorted even in desperation. Others tuck the coins into socks or sew them into hems of coats, fearing the next collapse. Historians still debate whether the Federal Reserve could have done more, cutting rates faster, lending more aggressively, to soften the blows of the Depression. Some call its hesitation a tragic failure. Others insist the Fed was simply too young and too timid, unable to wield its tools boldly. You, watching from the shadows of a cold soup kitchen, feel the consequences not as policy, but as hunger. A ladle scraping the bottom of a pot. A child's eyes widening when the last crust of bread is gone. President Franklin D. Roosevelt strides into this bleak stage with his inaugural words promising bold action. You follow him to March 1933, when he declares a national bank holiday, shutting down the system to halt the panic. For days, Banks are closed. Streets are eerily still, as if the heartbeat of money has been paused. Then, one by one, banks reopen under new regulations, their doors swinging wide to cautious crowds. To everyone's surprise, people begin redepositing their money. Trust, wounded but not dead, flickers back to life. A radical moment soon arrives. In a bold stroke, Roosevelt issues Executive Order 6102, forbidding the private hoarding of gold. Citizens are required to turn in their coins, their bars, their gold certificates, exchanging them for paper dollars at a fixed rate. You watch as men stand in post office lines with small bags clinking faintly at their sides, surrendering generations of savings. Some comply reluctantly. Others stash coins under floorboards, hoping inspectors never find them. Quirky tales spread, like the farmer who buried his gold in a mason jar beneath an oak tree, only to forget which oak years later. The Gold Reserve Act of 1934 follows, revaluing gold from $20.67 to $35 per ounce. Overnight, the dollar is devalued, and the government's hoard of gold expands dramatically. For ordinary citizens, it feels like a sleight of hand. But for the nation, it's a lifeline, giving the government greater power to inflate the money supply and jolt the economy awake. Scholars still debate whether this devaluation was bold genius or desperate gamble. Yet as you stand inside the glittering vaults at Fort Knox, newly filled with confiscated and purchased gold, you sense the transformation. The dollar is no longer a fragile child. It is a creature bound to the will of government itself. By the late 1930s, life stirs again. You wander a bustling diner where families pay for meatloaf and coffee with silver coins and dollar bills, their edges softened by countless hands. The radio hums with Roosevelt's fireside chats, his voice reassuring millions that their currency and banks are safe. A quirky snapshot catches your attention. Waitresses tap coins on the counter like drum beats, joking that this one sounds solid or this one's thin. Money becomes not just a medium of exchange, but a sound, a ritual, a daily reassurance that value still exists. And yet, as war clouds gather in Europe, the dollar's role stretches further than America's borders once again. Traders in London and Paris quietly hedge their bets by holding dollars, sensing stability across the Atlantic. The Great Depression has scarred trust, but paradoxically, it has also concentrated power. With gold locked away and the government standing behind every note, the dollar emerges from the 1930s bruised but strangely fortified, ready for the storm of global conflict that waits just beyond the horizon. You step into the summer air of 1944, and the world smells of ink, sweat, and the faint metallic tang of typewriter keys striking paper in a New Hampshire hotel. The war is not yet over, but in the Mount Washington Hotel at Bretton Woods, delegates from 44 nations gather to do something remarkable: design a monetary system for the world. You walk down carpeted corridors where men in rumpled suits argue in hushed tones, cigarettes glowing in the night as ashtrays overflow. The air feels heavy with urgency, because they know that when the guns fall silent, the world will need a framework strong enough to rebuild trust. Inside the Grand Conference Hall, you watch rows of delegates scribbling notes, whispering to translators, and glancing nervously at the American table. For all the debate, the balance is clear. The United States, untouched in its homeland and swollen with gold reserves, will shape the blueprint. John Maynard Keynes, representing Britain, rises with his sharp wit and tired eyes, proposing a new supranational currency he calls the Bancor. Across the aisle, Harry Dexter White of the U.S. Treasury shakes his head. The dollar, not the Bancor, will be the cornerstone. Historians still argue whether Keynes's plan might have created a fairer, more balanced system, one less tilted toward American dominance. But in that moment, you feel the tide already rolling in favor of the greenback. The dollar will be pegged to gold at $35 an ounce, and all other currencies will tie themselves to the dollar. Gold remains the ultimate anchor, but the dollar becomes the intermediary, the everyday measure of value. It is not yet the empire's coin, but the scaffolding is set. You slip into a smoky lounge that evening where delegates loosen their ties, sipping watered-down whiskey. One mutters about an American century. Another sighs about Britain's dwindling reserves, admitting what no one wants to say aloud. The pound sterling, once the world's anchor, has been quietly dethroned. A quirky moment unfolds as an exhausted delegate from South America falls asleep at the table, his notepad slipping into an ashtray, edges singed but still legible. Later, scholars chuckle about how some of the most important clauses in global finance were debated while men nodded off, over-caffeinated and underslept. When the agreement is signed, you feel the weight of it ripple outward like a tide. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank are born, institutions meant to stabilize economies and foster growth. The United States pledges to redeem dollars for gold, but only for foreign governments, not individuals. You sense the subtle but crucial shift. Ordinary people may no longer exchange their dollars for gold, but nations themselves must trust America's promise. The dollar is no longer just national. It has become a global responsibility. As the war ends, you walk among the ruins of Europe. In Berlin, rubble lies in mountains, and in Paris, ration cards are still clutched by hungry families. Yet everywhere, reconstruction begins, and the currency that flows into hands and contracts is the dollar. American trucks unload crates not only of food and medicine, but also of financial credit. The greenback becomes both relief and authority. A French shopkeeper tucks a U.S. dollar bill into his apron, saving it as a charm against the uncertain future. Scholarly uncertainty lingers even here. Was Bretton Woods truly a consensus of nations? Or was it an arrangement imposed by America's unique post-war position? Some historians see it as cooperative design, others as quiet economic imperialism. You, walking through the candlelit corridors of that New Hampshire hotel, hear both the harmony and the dissonance. Collaboration wrapped around a hard core of American power. The blueprint is set, the dollar now tied to gold and the world tied to the dollar. As you step into the late 1940s, you can feel its glow strengthening, not just as paper in wallets, but as the invisible spine of global commerce. The sun has not yet risen on the full extent of its reign, but the horizon is golden, and the world waits to see how brightly the dollar will shine. You find yourself in 1947, walking through the cracked boulevards of Europe, where the echoes of war still hang heavy in the air. Buildings stand half-collapsed, their stone ribs exposed like broken skeletons. Children play with tin cans in rubble-strewn alleys, their laughter thin against the background hum of hunger. Factories sit silent, chimneys cold, and railroads twisted like discarded toys. Into this bleak canvas flows something unexpected. The steady hum of American dollars, carried across the ocean not just as bills, but as ships laden with food, machinery, and raw materials. This is the Marshall Plan, announced in 1947 and set into motion the following year. An ambitious scheme to rebuild Europe. You sit in a crowded parliament chamber in Paris, where weary politicians argue about how to accept this aid. Some whisper that it is generosity, others mutter that it is quiet domination. But when the crates arrive, filled with wheat, tractors, and steel, the debate softens. You follow a shipment into a small French village, where families gather around sacks stamped USA. Bread rises again in ovens, and the smell drifts through streets that had long forgotten such abundance. At the heart of it all you see the dollar quietly working its diplomacy. Aid is dispersed in American currency, contracts written in American terms. A quirky story surfaces from Italy. Local shopkeepers, unused to American dollars, pin the notes behind counters like Lucky Charms before learning how to exchange them properly. In Germany, children play with empty aid boxes, transforming them into toy forts. While inside those boxes once lay the supplies that would rebuild their nation's industries. Historians still argue about motives. Was the Marshall Plan pure generosity? Or was it America's strategy to anchor Europe firmly in its orbit during the early chill of the Cold War? You, walking through warehouses stacked with dollar-financed goods, sense both realities coexisting. It is relief, yes, but it is also strategy, a weaving of dependency where Europe learns to measure its recovery in greenbacks. Beyond Europe, the dollar begins to seep into Asia. In Japan, under American occupation, new systems are built with dollar scaffolding. Tokyo streets, once bombed to ash, hum again with neon lights, powered by loans and investments tied to U.S. currency. You watch factory workers assemble radios and sewing machines, their wages ultimately pegged to the dollar's steady promise. A quirky detail sticks in your mind. In some neighborhoods, people collect American cigarette packs not for smoking, but as currency substitutes, trading them like miniature dollar bills. Back in Washington, policymakers speak with confidence. The Bretton Woods system is holding. Gold pegs remain firm. The dollar is strong. Yet even now, debates stir about how long America can maintain its dual role as both global supplier and global banker. Scholars still wonder if the Marshall Plan's success was inevitable given American resources, or whether it was the clever orchestration of political will. In the homes of Europe, however, abstraction melts into daily life. You sit at a German dinner table where a family gives thanks not only for the stew simmering on the stove, but for the fact that they can pay for potatoes and meat again with money that holds value. A father unfolds a crisp new bill, showing it proudly to his children. A U.S. dollar, exchanged for local currency at a rate that feels stable. In that moment, the green ink gleams brighter than the candlelight. The Marshall Plan winds down by the early 1950s, but its imprint remains. Factories hum, trains run, and currencies stabilize, all under the watchful shadow of the dollar. As you stroll through a newly rebuilt Rotterdam harbor, cranes unloading ships of American goods, you realize that this aid was not just material, but symbolic. The dollar has become more than a national currency. It is a bridge of trust, a silent partner in the rebirth of entire nations. And as you glance eastward, past the Iron Curtain where the dollar does not reach, you feel the contrast. Two halves of a world, one stitched together with greenbacks, the other sealed off in suspicion. The dollar's diplomacy is subtle, but you can hear its rhythm in every clink of rebuilt machinery and every rustle of new banknotes. A melody of power wrapped in the sound of paper. You slip quietly into the warm, tense air of August 1971, and the hum of television sets fills American living rooms. Families lean forward on couches, their dinners cooling on plates, as President Richard Nixon speaks in his clipped, deliberate voice. He announces something that feels technical, almost bland, but the world will later call it the Nixon shock. The dollar, he says, will no longer be redeemable for gold. The 35-ounce promise, the very anchor of the Bretton Woods system, is snapped in an instant. You sit in that living room, the glow of the black and white screen painting faces pale. For ordinary viewers, the announcement is confusing. What does it mean exactly, that the dollar is no longer tied to gold? For bankers and foreign governments, though, the meaning is seismic. They scramble through late-night calls, realizing that the world's currencies are about to drift into uncharted seas, floating freely without the old golden anchor. In the following days, you walk through foreign exchange markets in London, Paris, and Tokyo, where traders scribble frantically on chalkboards, trying to adjust to new realities. Some currencies rise, others fall, and the dollar itself wobbles before steadying, its reputation carrying it further than its gold reserves ever could. A quirky detail. In some offices, clerks use actual rulers to measure chalked-up graphs of exchange rates, a low-tech attempt to chart the dollar's uncertain flight. Historians still argue about whether Nixon had any real choice. Some say America could no longer sustain the strain of gold outflows as foreign governments redeemed dollars en masse. Others believe it was a calculated gamble, trusting that America's economic size alone could sustain the dollar's dominance. You, standing amid the hum of teletypes spitting out currency quotes, sense the unease of a world untethered, like sailors who suddenly discover the stars have vanished from the night sky. Through the 1970s, you watch as the dollar drifts into the new regime of floating exchange rates. No longer chained to gold, it dances with the tides of markets, buffeted by inflation, oil shocks, and political storms. In American grocery stores, shoppers mutter about prices rising faster than wages. You follow a woman down an aisle as she sighs at the cost of bread and butter, folding a crumpled dollar bill with a frown. The dollar buys less each week, and the hum of inflation becomes the background rhythm of life. At the same time, overseas, central banks hoard dollars even more fiercely. You stroll through the cavernous vaults of the Bank of Japan, stacks of U.S. currency piled neatly, an odd reversal. The very paper no longer guaranteed by gold becomes the most trusted reserve in the world. Scholars still puzzle at this paradox. Why the dollar, untethered, became stronger in global influence rather than weaker. Was it inertia, habit, or sheer trust in American power? The question lingers unanswered, like a riddle scratched into stone. A quirky image stays with you from the decade. Tourists from Europe visiting New York, marveling that the dollar, weakened in their home markets, lets them buy more clothes, records, and trinkets than ever before. Department store clerks joke that the French and Germans are cleaning us out, arms full of Levi's jeans and vinyl records. The floating dollar reshapes not only finance, but also shopping bags. By the late 1970s, stagflation grips America, an uncomfortable mix of unemployment and rising prices. Policymakers struggle, the Federal Reserve hesitates, and whispers grow louder. Can the dollar truly lead the world without gold? You sit in a dim bar where patrons debate the future. One insists gold will return. Another shakes his head, muttering that the old days are gone. Their glasses clink, echoing the unresolved uncertainty of the decade. As the 1980s approach, you feel the shift coming. New leaders will push the Fed to tighten, markets will adapt to volatility, and the dollar will reinvent itself once again, not as a golden promise, but as the fluid, floating currency of a world increasingly wired together. The old anchor is gone, and yet the ship sails on. The dollar, unmoored, has not sunk. It drifts, battered by storms, but somehow steadier than the currencies trying to catch it. You lean against a wall, hearing the hum of exchange floors, the scratch of chalk, the rustle of paper, and realize that the dollar has entered a new era. No longer a weight of metal, but a symbol carried on trust, habit, and sheer momentum. You wander into the heat of the 1970s desert, where sand stretches endlessly and the smell of oil seeps from the ground like a hidden fire. Beneath the shade of a palace awning in Saudi Arabia, American and Saudi officials sit cross-legged on carpets, their words careful but heavy with consequence. The deal is simple in its phrasing, but immense in its effect. Oil, the lifeblood of the industrial world, will be priced in US dollars. The petrodollar is born, tying barrels of black gold to green paper. You imagine the handshake, a gesture small enough to be overlooked, yet one that links two global necessities forever. From now on, whether a French factory or a Japanese power plant needs oil, the purchase must pass through the dollar. Ships creak in harbors. Tankers groan under the weight of crude, and in every contract signed, the greenback becomes the intermediary. Historians still debate the exact balance of power in this deal. Was it America's pressure, Saudi pragmatism, or mutual necessity? You sense it was all three, woven together in the quiet arithmetic of survival. You walk through a bustling oil market in Rotterdam, where traders shout across the floor, chalking up prices on massive boards. The numbers rise and fall, but always in dollars. A quirky detail makes you pause. Some traders carry pocket calculators engraved with tiny dollar symbols, a practical joke turned into a badge of reality. The dollar has seeped so deeply into the oil trade that even tools for tallying prices wear its emblem. Meanwhile, back in America, inflation gnaws at wages, but the dollar's grip abroad strengthens. You sit in a diner where truckers sip coffee, grumbling about rising gas prices, unaware that halfway around the globe, their complaints echo in a London office where bankers discuss recycling petrodollars into loans for developing nations. Oil exporters earn dollars, banks reinvest those dollars, and the cycle spins, feeding projects from highways in Brazil to factories in South Korea. The 1973 oil crisis sharpens this reality. You stand in line at a gas station in Ohio, the queue stretching around the block. Engines sputter, tempers flare, and a sign reads, "Limit, 10 gallons per customer." The irony is stark. The very currency oil is priced in now feels powerless to buy enough of it. Scholars still argue whether the petrodollar arrangement stabilized the system or deepened America's vulnerability to shocks. For you, sitting on a car hood under the dim glow of a street lamp, the dollar feels both omnipresent and oddly helpless. In Riyadh, oil wealth transforms the skyline. You stroll through a market where merchants once traded spices and fabrics, but now count crisp dollar bills, stacking them high in glass cases. Gold jewelry gleams, imported electronics fill stalls, and the chatter of Arabic mixes with the faint rustle of dollars passed hand to hand. The green paper has become a passport to global luxuries. Quirky anecdotes circulate. Engineers in Kuwait joke that they are paid by the barrel, since their salaries, though denominated in local currency, are effectively pegged to the dollar through oil. In Nigeria, children flip through old magazines and cut out dollar signs, taping them to walls as symbols of imagined wealth. The iconography of the dollar spreads like graffiti across cultures. By the late 1970s, you watch policymakers in Washington breathe easier. The gold standard is gone, but the dollar has found a new foundation in oil. Every nation that drives, flies, or powers its factories with petroleum must first hold dollars. The greenback, once backed by metal, is now backed by motion. The ceaseless churn of engines, the hum of electricity, the invisible burn of oil. Historians remain uncertain. Was the petrodollar system deliberately crafted as a strategy, or did it emerge organically from necessity? Perhaps both. What you know, standing at the edge of a Saudi oil field as flames roar from venting towers, is that the dollar has latched itself to the very fuel of the modern age. And as tankers sail out under the rising sun, their cargo measured in dollars, you feel the subtle but powerful truth. The greenback has become as fluid as oil itself, coursing through pipelines, contracts, and bank vaults, shaping the rhythm of the world. You drift into the 1980s, a decade of glowing neon lights, computer terminals humming in financial districts, and cargo ships groaning under the weight of global trade. The dollar having survived the stormy 1970s, now asserts itself with renewed confidence. You stand on the New York Stock Exchange floor, where traders in brightly colored jackets wave paper slips and shout bids. Above them, the flicker of electronic boards shows exchange rates. Yen, marks, pounds, yet all compared against the dollar. The deficits begin to grow. America imports more than it exports, filling warehouses with Japanese electronics, German cars, and Taiwanese textiles. You watch as families in suburban malls buy televisions and VCRs with dollars earned at home, each purchase quietly adding to America's trade imbalance. Yet paradoxically, this imbalance strengthens the dollar's global role. Those dollars flow overseas, and foreign banks, manufacturers, and governments all hold them, reinvesting back into U.S. assets. Scholars still puzzle over this paradox: how a debtor nation could sustain dominance, its very weakness becoming the root of its strength. Step aboard a cargo ship steaming toward Los Angeles, its containers stacked high with goods. Inside one, you find crates of Sony Walkmans, each destined for American teenagers eager to soundtrack their lives. Payment for the shipment: U.S. dollars wired through international banks. A quirky image lingers: dock workers in Yokohama counting wages in yen, but whispering about dollar values as if the greenback were a second language. The dollar's shadow falls even on currencies not its own. Meanwhile, on Wall Street, debt becomes the new commodity. Treasury bonds, once staid and dull, are suddenly the hottest ticket. Safe investments denominated in the world's reserve currency. You walk through a brokerage office where young analysts in suspenders scribble calculations, their calculators clicking rapidly. They call themselves bond vigilantes, watching every move of the U.S. government, ready to demand higher interest rates if deficits spiral too far. Yet despite their swagger, they keep buying. Why? Because the dollar is still the safest harbor in a sea of volatility. In 1985, you find yourself in the opulent Plaza Hotel in New York, where finance ministers and central bankers from the world's leading economies gather around a polished mahogany table. Their goal: to weaken the surging dollar, which has climbed so high it threatens global trade balances. They sign the Plaza Accord, pledging to coordinate interventions in currency markets. Outside, the city hums with traffic, unaware that the world's financial elites have just nudged exchange rates with the stroke of a pen. Historians debate whether this moment was necessary fine-tuning or dangerous manipulation. But the spectacle of cooperation reveals how central the dollar has become. Other currencies adjust themselves like dancers moving to the rhythm of America's tune. On the streets of Mexico City and São Paulo, debt crises erupt as countries that borrowed heavily in dollars struggle to repay. You see protesters march with banners denouncing foreign bankers, yet behind the slogans lies a harsh truth. Oil exporting and developing nations alike must repay their debts in dollars, no matter how their local currencies collapse. A quirky detail arises. In some Latin American cities, barbers and street vendors begin quoting their prices in dollars, even though payment is made in pesos, a psychological admission of which currency they truly trust. At the same time, in Tokyo, traders watch their screens as the yen strengthens after the Plaza Accord, making Japanese goods more expensive abroad. Some mutter that America's policies tilt the scales unfairly, but they still price exports in dollars. You notice the contradiction: resentment and dependence interwoven, like two threads in the same fabric. Back in America, the Federal Reserve, under Paul Volcker and later Alan Greenspan, battles inflation with high interest rates. You sit in a Midwest farmhouse where a family frowns over their mortgage bill, payments swelling beyond their means. Yet overseas, investors smile. eager to pour money into high-yielding U.S. bonds. The very pain of American borrowers becomes the magnet drawing foreign capital, cementing the dollar's role. By the close of the decade, you wander Times Square, neon signs blazing, billboards advertising Coca-Cola and Marlboro. And beneath it all, the pulse of a financial system more global than ever. The dollar, once tied to gold, now floats on a sea of debt, trade, and trust. Historians remain uncertain. Is this dominance sustainable? Or is it a precarious balance waiting to collapse? But as you feel the buzz of the 1980s, the laughter in crowded restaurants, the chatter of traders on phones the size of bricks, one truth is clear. The dollar is not retreating. It is expanding, flowing into every corner of global life, as persistent and undeniable as the glow of neon in the night. You ease into the 1990s, where the hum of computers begins to replace the clatter of typewriters, and the glow of green digits on black screens feels like a new kind of heartbeat. The dollar now lives not only in wallets and vaults, but also in streams of electronic code zipping across wires under oceans. You wander into a Wall Street trading floor where monitors blink endlessly and traders stare at pixelated graphs that dance with dizzying speed. The dollar's reach, once carried by ships and paper contracts, is now multiplied by circuits and screens. Credit cards spread like wildfire. You pull one from a leather wallet, its plastic sheen embossed with raised numbers, and slide it across a counter in a suburban American mall. A beep, a receipt, a smile. The entire transaction completed in seconds. Invisible dollars moving through digital veins. Overseas, the same plastic rectangles appear in London, Tokyo, and Singapore, all settled in US dollars behind the scenes. A quirky detail sticks with you. Some early adopters of credit cards in Eastern Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union reportedly used them just to show off at restaurants, signing slips proudly even though the waiters had to call banks long distance to confirm the payment. Meanwhile, the internet emerges, clunky but promising. You log onto a dial-up connection, the modem screeching like a mechanical bird. Early online marketplaces experiment with selling books, CDs, even plane tickets, all priced in dollars. Though shoppers still hesitate, typing credit card numbers nervously, the framework of digital commerce is laid. And once again, the dollar is the chosen language of trade. Historians still debate whether the digital revolution would have amplified any dominant currency, or whether the dollar's pre-existing supremacy ensured it became the default. Either way, you watch as America's greenback slips seamlessly into cyberspace. Global finance expands in new ways. Derivatives, complex contracts with exotic names, multiply, their values counted in trillions, almost all denominated in dollars. You sit in a glass-walled office where young bankers sketch equations on whiteboards, their markers squeaking as they laugh over jargon that sounds more like code than money. Yet beneath the complexity lies a simple truth. The dollar is the measuring stick for nearly all of it. A quirky memory surfaces from Chicago's trading pits, where traders in the 1990s still shout orders by hand signals, flapping arms and wiggling fingers like a bizarre dance, even as computerization renders the ritual obsolete. In Asia, economies boom. You stroll through the glittering streets of Seoul, the neon signs buzzing overhead, while beneath the surface, billions of borrowed dollars fuel the expansion of factories, highways, and skyscrapers. The same happens in Bangkok, Jakarta, and Kuala Lumpur. Local currencies circulate, but the contracts that fund growth are written in green. You can almost feel the dependency forming, like roots entwined around a foreign tree. Then comes 1997. The Asian financial crisis erupts, sparked by speculative attacks on currencies tied too tightly to the dollar. You find yourself in Bangkok as exchange shops adjust their chalkboards hourly, bot values plummeting against the greenback. Families who borrowed in dollars now see their debts double overnight. The mood is panic, markets crashing, livelihoods evaporating. And yet, in the storm, investors cling to dollars as safe haven, buying U.S. Treasury bonds even as entire economies stumble. Historians still argue whether this reliance on the dollar amplified the crisis or provided the very stability needed to recover. Back in America, prosperity hums. Dot-com companies rise, their stock tickers glowing on NASDAQ screens, each trade whispered in dollars. You peer into a cluttered garage where two young entrepreneurs code late into the night. Their startup funded by venture capital that flows easily thanks to global dollar liquidity. Their dream is the internet. Their fuel is the dollar. By the end of the 1990s, as fireworks burst to celebrate a new millennium, you realize how far the greenback has come. Once coins bitten to test authenticity, once paper distrusted in taverns, now it streams invisibly across fiber optic cables, backing credit cards, powering global markets, funding skyscrapers, and cushioning crises. Scholars remain uncertain. Is this dominance the result of deliberate strategy, or is it simply the inertia of history's momentum? You stand quietly as midnight bells ring, sensing the paradox. The dollar is both more abstract than ever, no longer tied to gold, scarcely even physical, and yet more tangible in daily life than at any time in history. You step into the closing years of the 20th century and the first decade of the 21st, when the dollar becomes both a lifeline and a paradox. The world spins faster now. Capital zips across continents in microseconds, airlines fly full, cargo ships cross oceans in endless streams. And yet, in times of crisis, people still reach for the same thing they always have. The dollar, folded in wallets, glowing on screens, whispered in contracts. You begin in 1997, lingering among the panic-stricken streets of Jakarta. Crowds gather at money changers, chalkboards erased and rewritten every hour as the rupiah collapses. Families clutch dollars as if they are charms, some storing bills in jars, others sewing them into clothes. In Bangkok, posters of half-finished skyscrapers flap in the hot wind, monuments to projects built with dollar loans now abandoned in dust. A quirky scene catches your eye. Street vendors in Manila who, unable to trust their own currency, start accepting small U.S. notes for bowls of noodles, their smiles weary but relieved. The pattern repeats in 1998, this time in Moscow. You walk through the crowded corridors of a Russian bank as employees scramble, their ruble nearly worthless. Outside, kiosks sell goods priced in dollars, even though official laws forbid it. Historians still argue whether these crises revealed the dollar's strength as anchor or the weakness of a system overly reliant on one nation's paper. For you, watching families counting wrinkled $1 bills like treasure, the answer feels painfully human. Trust beats policy. Fast forward to 2008. You stand in the heart of Manhattan, where the air is filled with sirens, shouting, and the hollow echo of disbelief. Lehman Brothers has collapsed. Employees stream out of its glass tower carrying cardboard boxes stuffed with personal belongings, framed family photos, mugs, desk plants. The financial system trembles. Across the world, newspapers scream in bold fonts, "Global crisis." Stock markets plunge like stones, and trust evaporates. And yet, what do investors do? They flood into U.S. Treasury bonds, pouring money into the very heart of the storm's origin. The dollar, paradoxically, becomes a safe harbor even as American banks crumble. You sit in a Tokyo office where traders shake their heads in disbelief, muttering that the greenback is both the poison and the cure. A quirky image lingers. In some European cities, Shopkeepers tape signs in their windows that read, "Dollars accepted." A reminder that in panic, the world reverts to the familiar. Scholars still debate whether the Federal Reserve's extraordinary actions, slashing rates, pumping liquidity, saved the world or merely postponed deeper reckoning. But you, listening to the calm monotone of then-Chairman Ben Bernanke, assuring markets that the system will hold, hear more than policy. You hear the soothing lullaby of a currency that, despite flaws, still commands belief. You travel next to China, where warehouses hum with production, their lights blazing through the night. Every crate bound for American shelves is labeled in dollars, every contract priced in green. Trillions of reserves pile up in Beijing's vaults, a mountain of dollar-denominated securities. Officials speak publicly of diversifying, but privately, they cannot escape. The world has woven itself into a fabric whose threads are dyed in dollar green. Quirky tales emerge even in small places. In Zimbabwe, during its hyperinflation, street stalls abandon local notes altogether, pricing tomatoes, bus fares, and haircuts directly in dollars. The U.S. currency becomes daily bread, slipping into pockets where American soil has never been touched. As you step back, you see the paradox deepen. The dollar is both fragile and unassailable, criticized as the source of crisis, yet clung to as salvation. Historians argue whether another currency could replace it, whether gold or the euro might ascend. But each time turmoil strikes, the world answers by buying more dollars. And so you leave the first decade of the new millennium with the image clear. Skyscrapers trembling, banks collapsing, markets screaming. Yet in the center, the dollar holds, its paper and digital pulses reminding the world that even flawed anchors are anchors all the same. You step into the early 21st century, and the air feels charged with whispers of rivalry. The dollar still dominates, but around every corner you hear questions. Can it last? In Brussels, European leaders unveil the euro in 1999, sleek and modern. With coins glinting and banknotes freshly pressed, their bridges and arches designed to look timeless, yet neutral. You stand in a crowded cafe in Paris, where people trade francs for euros, glancing skeptically at this new paper. Some fold it carefully into wallets. Others joke that it looks like monopoly money. And yet, behind the smiles lies ambition. The dream of a currency that might one day rival the dollar. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, China's yuan stirs in quiet strength. You wander through Shanghai's skyline, cranes silhouetted against neon lights, factories pounding out goods destined for every corner of the globe. Each shipment is priced in dollars, yet officials in Beijing talk of internationalizing their currency. Scholars still argue whether the yuan could ever dethrone the dollar, given capital controls and political constraints. For now, the dream flickers, distant but real. Gold, too, refuses to vanish. In vaults deep beneath cities, bars are stacked neatly, their surfaces gleaming under fluorescent light. You picture investors in times of uncertainty rushing to buy gold, whispering that it is the real money. And yet, when transactions must be made, when oil tankers sail, when airlines buy fuel, when governments pay debts, it is dollars that change hands. The contrast is sharp. Gold is hoarded, the dollar is used. A quirky story unfolds in West Africa. In local markets, traders use CFA francs, a currency pegged first to the French franc and later to the euro. Yet when large contracts are signed, timber, cocoa, or minerals, they are denominated in dollars. Villagers laugh softly that they sell cocoa for CFA, but dream of saving dollars under mattresses. In Moscow, you overhear discussions of pricing oil in rubles instead of dollars. In Tehran, whispers of bypassing the greenback ripple through bazaars. Yet each attempt collides with reality. International buyers prefer the liquidity and safety of the dollar. Scholars still debate whether these challenges are serious threats or symbolic gestures, but you see them as echoes in a cavern where the dollar's voice still carries loudest. At the same time, technology changes the conversation. Bitcoin emerges in 2009, an odd, fragile experiment. You lean over a coder's shoulder in a dim basement where glowing screens show lines of cryptographic puzzles. Few take it seriously yet, but it plants a seed. Could money exist beyond the dollar's grasp? A quirky memory surfaces. The first known Bitcoin purchase, 2 pizzas, bought for 10,000 coins, now remembered as a fortune traded for melted cheese. The euro rises through the 2000s, even surpassing the dollar briefly in total circulation. Yet the global financial crisis of 2008 reminds investors of the old anchor. While Europe struggles with debt crises in Greece, Spain, and Italy, the dollar remains steady. In times of calm, rivals boast. In times of storm, the world returns to green paper. By the 2010s, you stand in airports across continents. Duty-free shops list prices in multiple currencies, but the dollar is always the first reference. Tourists clutch wallets where different bills mingle, but when in doubt, the greenback is accepted. A shopkeeper in Istanbul winks, slipping a crisp $20 bill into his till, muttering, "Always good." Historians remain uncertain. Will the dollar's supremacy end in gradual erosion or sudden collapse? Some say the euro, the yuan, or even digital assets will one day claim the throne. Others insist that habits, institutions, and trust are too deeply woven for replacement. You, wandering through global markets, feel the tension. The dollar is not unchallenged, but every rival, so far, stumbles. And so, as you reach the present day, you hear the greenback's quiet hum in every corner. A taxi fare in Buenos Aires quoted in dollars, a stock contract in London settled in dollars, a barrel of oil in Riyadh priced in dollars. The rivals rise and fall, yet the dollar continues to flow, not just as currency, but as the background rhythm of a globalized age. You stand now in the present day, the air filled with the whir of smartphones, the glow of digital wallets, and the invisible pulse of servers humming in hidden data centers. The dollar no longer feels like just paper bills or metal coins. It exists in numbers glowing on screens, in lines of code that travel faster than the blink of an eye, in contracts written in legalese but understood by merchants from Buenos Aires to Bangkok. You wander through an airport lounge in Dubai, where flight attendants speak in multiple languages but list ticket prices in US dollars first. In the duty-free shop, perfumes, electronics, and chocolates are tagged in local dirhams. Yet the clerk smiles when a passenger hands over a crisp $100 bill. It is accepted without question, folded into the register with the ease of habit. A quirky detail lingers. In some African towns, children collect empty chewing gum wrappers printed with dollar symbols, pinning them to walls as decorations, as if the image itself carries magic. Across oceans, central banks still hoard dollars in reserve. You walk into a vault in Singapore where neatly stacked bundles of green notes sit alongside gold bars and government bonds. Officials speak carefully about diversification, but the reality is plain. When trade flows, when crises erupt, when debts come due, it is the dollar that clears the accounts. Scholars still argue whether this is sustainable, or whether the world is merely waiting for an alternative to rise strong enough. Yet for decades, none has. You pause in Buenos Aires, where inflation makes the local peso unreliable. Shopkeepers lean across counters and whisper prices in dollars, even if payments are made in pesos. In Lagos, car dealers advertise their vehicles with dollar values scrawled on windshields. In Moscow, amid sanctions and strained trade, citizens still stash U.S. bills in drawers, a form of private insurance against uncertainty. The greenback has become more than currency. It is a language of survival. Digital technology deepens this. You drift into a fintech office in San Francisco, where coders write algorithms for cross-border payments. Transactions zip invisibly across the globe, yet most still settle in dollars. Even cryptocurrencies, for all their rebellion, often measure their worth against the greenback. A quirky scene catches your eye. A trader in Seoul watches a Bitcoin chart on one screen and a dollar-yen chart on another, muttering that he trusts neither but needs both. And still, uncertainty lingers. Scholars debate whether the dollar's dominance is a relic of history, propped up by habit, or a dynamic force constantly renewed by America's economic weight. Some wonder whether a multipolar world of currencies will emerge. Others insist the greenback's roots run too deep to be displaced quickly. You, watching a cargo ship glide into port in Singapore, see the truth written in steel containers. Invoices denominated in dollars, insurance in dollars, payments in dollars. The echoes stretch backward and forward. From coins bitten by farmers in taverns to electronic signals in fiber-optic cables, the dollar has grown from fragile promise to global bloodstream. Its story is unfinished, ever flowing. It may one day give way. But tonight, in the quiet rhythm of your listening, it endures. And now, the tempo slows. The clamor of trading floors softens into whispers. The glow of airport shops dims into candlelight. The dollar, once a jangling coin, now hums like a lullaby across oceans, its pulse steady, its song familiar. You breathe out, letting the noise of markets fade, replaced by the hush of history's echo. Think of all the hands that have held it, all the voices that have whispered its name, all the lives it has touched in ways subtle and grand. The greenback may be a tool, a strategy, even an empire in paper form. But here, in the stillness of night, it is just a story, drifting through time like a quiet tide. And so, you let your thoughts loosen, like leaves falling onto a calm river. The dollar's future will unfold tomorrow, and tomorrow again. But for now, you can rest, knowing that history's currents carry you gently, steadily, into silence.